From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi again. Welcome to the show. I'm Ken Davis, and it's Chicago Newsroom for yet another week. And we're being joined this week by two of our old friends, great folks to have here on the show. Alden Loury is joining us from the BGA, Better Government Association, an investigator and writer, journalist, and that's something we need to talk about too, the fact that the BGA is becoming a journalism shop, or has become one. Glad to have you here again, and of course in your capacity as the former president of the Chicago Headline Club too. So great to have you back. And David Schaper from NPR is here. David, one of those guys who works in Chicago, but at the moment's notice gets flung off into scenes of disaster and other things to report back to us.
Surprised I'm not in Washington right now. Right?
Yeah, I'm
scenes of disaster.
That's right. Speaking of disasters, yeah. So you know, let's since we have this NPR expertise at the table here, it does feel, not to parrot our friends at Fox News, but it does feel here in Chicago like it's a kind of a non-story. We don't seem to be feeling any effects of this government shutdown. Is that fair?
I think it is fair to say that there's not a widespread impact across the board, because so many federal agencies and so many things the federal government does, the workers who perform those jobs are deemed essential. TSA is probably the best example. At the airports, they're not going to shut down security at the airports. They're going to keep those wonderful lines moving so slowly through O'Hare and Midway.
We want them to get longer.
And you know, the FAA, which in the control towers, obviously, if you want to keep planes flying, you're going to have the FAA in almost full operations. But there was, I thought, an interesting op-ed on the website of Crain's Chicago Business this week from a federal Department of Labor employee saying, you know, here are some of the things that we do that is not being done now, and talking about, you know, the levels of chemicals that workers in certain types of industries and certain factories are exposed to, making sure that those guidelines that are in existence are followed, and you know, ensuring the safety and well-being of employees is an important aspect of what our government does. Those things are not going on. The EPA, I think the figure in the EPA is something like 95 or 7% of the employees of that agency. I think there's a lot of people who believe, you know, ensuring that we have clean drinking water and safe air to breathe is an important function of government. So there are impacts out there, and it's also going to take a little while for a shutdown to really start impacting. You know, okay, there's not a meat inspection or whatever it may be this week. Well, you know, when does it really start affecting the chain of food getting to the grocery store? It will probably take several weeks for a bigger, broader impact to be felt. Well,
I know we've seen from the Republican Party their efforts to try to add things back in, like the World War II memorial, for example, all those other incredibly vital functions of government. So we'll see where that goes. So Alden, how are you doing?
I'm doing good.
You didn't say anything about the impact on Chicago. I guess that's because from a Better Government Association perspective, you're not seeing
no, there is actually a lot that can be said about that. You know, when you look at the stalemate that's happening in D.C., I mean, at the heart of it, I think without question is politics. And I think it is a very good case study for, you know, what's kind of been wrong with government and things that we're, you know, actively engaging and looking into on a daily basis. When government officials are more interested in kind of toting the party line or political line rather than really serving the public, the taxpayers, we get things like this. And, you know, the argument notwithstanding right now, but the seeds for this kind of debacle have been brewing for a long time. So yeah, so this certainly is something that I think people should be enraged and upset about, even if they don't feel a very direct impact on that. And like David said, I think as the days and perhaps weeks go on, because there is quite an impasse right now, and that could change certainly, but but we could start seeing what might be considered very critical functions that are reliant on federal dollars for folks who are desperately in need. All of the government subsidies that help those folks. There was a report this morning about Head Start programs in another state that are going to start slowing down and eventually shutting down as a result of the shutdown. So.
Well, obviously that's one of those bigger national pictures that we just have to kind of watch for a while and hope that something gets resolved, although it sure doesn't look, from here anyway, like there's any immediate resolution coming up on this.
Well, I think both sides back themselves into a certain corner where they don't really have much room to give. If you're talking about compromise from the Republican side in the House of Representatives, I think there's a strong feeling that the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, was passed with a majority of Democrats in both chambers of the Congress, and it was done so in 2010. In the next election, in the fall of 2010, those majorities were lost, or at least in the House it was lost. So they feel like they have a new majority that was elected to repeal it, or at least defund it, and they're going to stick to their guns because that's why they're elected, that's why they're in office, and they're going to not give up that position, not give up that ground whatsoever. On the White House perspective, they're saying, and the Democrats are saying, if you have a bill you want to offer, if you want changes to make to the Affordable Care Act, if they voted to repeal it outright, what is it, 49, 50 times or something like that, that's gone nowhere. So if you want to offer us changes, fine, but do that in a separate process. Let's separate it out from the budget that funds government operations. So it's a very difficult, and the president has said, I'm not going to negotiate on that as part of this budget. If you want to talk about it separately, but so you've got these two sides backed into certain positions and corners, and we saw them come out after, what was it, just an hour or hour and a half of negotiations last night at the White House, coming out with both sides saying, we haven't budged, and so it could go on for quite some time.
Well, I guess the all eyes right now, of course, are on John Boehner and what he's going to do, because he's the one guy who kind of triggered all of this. If there could be one person you could identify, and he's the one who might be able to come up with the grand compromise, but boy, that looks...
Well, all he has to do is call a bill that the Senate passed for a vote and see if the votes are there. If his caucus is truly united, they will defeat it. His caucus clearly isn't united, so he won't call that bill. I think his position would be a lot stronger if they actually called that bill for a vote and shot it down, because then I think both sides would have to say, the Senate Democrats and the House Republicans,
we're truly deadlocked.
Here, we're in a deadlock here. You killed our bill, we killed your bill. We got to find some middle ground there.
So let's talk about some Chicago things that have been going on. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen sort of incrementally developing stories and a lot of things. But I was kind of fascinated by this, by the fact that Mayor Emanuel took the high ground this week and announced that 18 of the intersections that, well, actually Mayor Daley had camera-ized a long time ago, have become so effectively calmed by these cameras that they're no longer needed, so they're going to take them all down. And of course, only a cynic would say, maybe that's just because people are actually kind of learning and they've got devices on their dashboard telling them that there's a red light camera ahead, and they're just slowing down a little bit. So as we're seeing, the revenue from these cameras is beginning to go down. So it occurred to me that maybe Mayor Emanuel, who is a very smart guy and very attuned to business, has been learning something from the Apple company that everybody was kind of scratching their heads when they cannibalized the iPod and said, we're going to take all of the benefits of this and move it into our new product, the iPhone, which means, of course, you probably won't be buying iPods a few years from now. And everybody thought this was a ridiculous idea, but of course it was genius because now they're making more money. And it's kind of a similar situation. It's like, I think what you're seeing is that all across the country, these red light cameras are beginning to diminish in the amount of money that they're bringing in. There's no real future for them, but boy, there is a huge future for the speed cameras. So what we got to do is we got to start pulling these out where they're not working and put them in more and more parks so that we can really make some money on the parks. Any thoughts on that, or is that just the ranting of a?
Obviously, the cynic said when red light cameras went in, and now with the speed cameras going in, that this is not about public safety. This is not about trying to reduce accidents. It's about generating revenue, and what a great, easy way to generate a ton of revenue. This allows Mayor Emanuel to say, hey, no, that's not the case at all. And here are, what is it, 18 intersections?
Yeah.
We no longer need them because they've worked.
Yeah.
People are stopping. They're not running the red lights. They're not trying to beat the yellow. They're not. We're not having a lot of accidents at those intersections anymore. So in a small, because I think that, I don't know how many, there's well over 100, there's probably a couple hundred red light cameras.
It's over 300 actually.
So right. And there are 300 speeding cameras authorized.
This is just a gesture to say this is not just about the revenue. It's about public safety.
Although I think what's interesting is one thing we don't know, unless I've missed it, is exactly what kind of revenue these 18 cameras were actually bringing in. And if these are cameras that are on the lower end, you can make an argument that, well, okay, if you're going to make a sacrifice, these are the cameras to sacrifice.
My guess is that they wouldn't be high revenue generators, and maybe there was a point where they were, and people have decided to stop, and they're just not generating much revenue anymore because they're not needed as much anymore.
One of them, just for example, to pick a good example, one of them is Hollywood and Sheridan. Okay, now. I think anybody who lives north of 35th Street has probably been at that intersection at some time or another, and you know that 24 hours a day, it's just this bottleneck of traffic trying to get onto the north end of Lakeshore Drive. I don't think that those cameras are going to generate very much speeding ticket revenue, because that's one place in Chicago where there is no speeding going on. And they might generate a little bit of red light business once in a while, but really, I mean, come on, we don't need that camera there. We need that camera like the one that, who was it today in Kim Strickland at City Mom blog, the Tribune thing said today, she was writing about Challenger Park, which is this little strip of green along the L tracks that runs south from Irving Park over by Cubs Park, which is essentially really a parking lot. There's no play equipment, there's nothing in it. It is legally a park. But what it really is a chance to put speed cameras along Irving Park Road along that cemetery there. So you're going to get people who are driving at 48 miles an hour. It is going to be a cash cow. But of course, we're doing it for the children. So.
Well, I will say that in my neighborhood where they've put up some speed cameras, this is the North Mayfair neighborhood, along Foster Avenue and along Pulaski, you have people who get off the Edens Expressway and then head east at incredibly high rates of speed. You have a park, Gompers Park, that is bisected by the by Foster Avenue. And it's unbelievable how many close calls we've had, and there's been a few accidents with cars and vehicles, but the big thing is the pedestrians. You have a ball field on one side and the field house on the other, and if somebody needs to use the restroom, they've got to cross a very, very busy street with cars hurtling at 50, 60 miles an hour.
So you see some value in these things?
In that instance, I think it's a perfect case. Now, the other thing that they wanted to do is put them around schools. Well, most of the schools, at least the ones that are off of the thoroughfares, the ones that are on side streets, already have speed bumps all up and down the streets around the schools to slow traffic. Certainly you want cars slowing down and being cautious when there are school children present, but it seems like that's already taken care of a lot of the speeding problems. And I don't know what the cameras will
It's pretty hard to drive 30 miles an hour down one of the streets with two
you hit one of those
bumps
speed bumps going fast.
Well, that's always been my thought, though, is that if there's an argument to make about safety and about excessive speed, and I think there certainly is, that it needs to be curbed in some parts of the city, there are other ways to do it
There
than
certainly
installing
are.
speed cameras. The other thing too is I think there will always be a cloud over these kinds of things, in my mind at least, because the Inspector General came out with a report around the red light cameras saying that the city's argument around the safety issue with regard to those cameras, they hadn't really backed it up with data. And so city's cash strapped, as we know. Annually we hear about the troubles with the budget. So anytime there's an idea for a new revenue stream, I think people are going to always be somewhat skeptical when it is purported that this isn't about revenue, it's about something else.
I guess I've said it a bunch of times on the show here, but I think I could accept it much more if it was just called a sin tax, like cigarettes or something. It's like, we know everybody speeds, and so we're gonna ding you for speeding, and we've got the technology to do it now, and we're just gonna do it, and shut up and pay the bill, because I mean that just would be a lot more honest, I think. But anyway. So the next thing is, now what we got to do is we got to figure out a way for Comcast to report to the city every time you watch one of those naughty channels that they have, and fine you $100 for that. Yeah.
Is that illegal?
No, but no, I guess. That's the problem. It's not illegal,
there
right?
You go.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the bad idea.
You could tax it more. I'm sure they'll probably just come up with a great idea. We'll see an ordinance introduced next week. So.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks. Yeah. Another story that happened today this week that I really wanted to run by you guys, because I find this incredibly, this is one of these little stories that gets like 3 paragraphs, but I think it's incredibly interesting, is that Mayor Emanuel has brought in a bunch of experts from Code for America to take a look at 311 and see what can be done to make 311 more efficient. And for once, I'm not being cynical. I'm not criticizing. It sounds like, yeah, why not? 311 has obviously been a great service from the day it was initiated, but it's been kind of clunky. It's 15 years old now, and why can't it be, as the mayor said, something like tracking your package from UPS? I mean, the private sector has figured out ways to make this very efficient. The thing that I find interesting about it is what it means for aldermen. And I think, as guys who've been around and watched the city operate for a long time, there was a lot of pushback when 311 first went in. And partly that pushback came quietly from aldermen who were saying, that's my job. I want people to call me when there's a street light out because that's what I do. And now all of those kind of aldermanic functions could be completely they could be surpassed. They could be completely automated with this, right? You just punch in your code, and who needs to talk to an alderman? Am I going off the handle here again, or is there something to this?
No, I mean, I think it's been clearly established over the decades that, they have a legislative role, but really in Chicago, they're more about the nuts and bolts of getting city services delivered, and it's really the source of power for aldermen in some ways. Good aldermen who have clout are able to get things done. They can go to their constituents come election time and say, hey, look, you needed something done. I was able to get it done. Vote me in office. Aldermen who don't have clout and have their requests and other matters dragged on don't have that power and can't make the same kind of statements come election time, and consequently, it's made it difficult for folks to be kind of quote unquote independent. But you're right. If there is a more efficient way to get city services handled, those requests taken care of, then there is presumably, under the model that we've employed for so long, a less reason for that. And I think there's also been renewed discussion among council members about the mayor's seemingly off the handle kind of suggestion when he first got elected that let's cut the city council in half. And I think that talk has kind of resurfaced now, and even with some support from aldermen. No, I think it's still early, but this could become something very interesting, especially if those conversations happen along dual tracks. One
of the things that I think we've seen with our beloved mayor is that although he seems like he's this kind of hyperkinetic guy who's running around, has got to get everything done now, he does seem to have a kind of a long vision about things. And what we're seeing that happen with the schools, where you know, more and more of the privatization of the schools is gradually and inexorably happening.
Can we actually call it that now? I mean, is that on the table clearly enough?
That's what I would call it. and I'm not even saying that in a deprecating way, but that just seems to be what's going on. The grid system going in for garbage collection and everything else is gradually beginning to sort of professionalize and, I don't know what you would call it, but sort of streamline city services in a way that we just never imagined could be done in Chicago.
Well, in a lot of ways, it does make sense to bring city services into the, not even the 21st, but the 20th century in some ways.
The late 20th century.
You know, the old system, and the aldermen did have a lot of control over a lot of city services. Ward superintendents are often in the same office building.
Absolutely.
From streets and sanitation are right next to the aldermen, and they work hand in hand. But you see that, you know, the sort of gerrymandering that's been done in certain wards to keep certain people in power, or to create certain ethnic majority districts, means that sometimes you'll have a ward that looks worse than a piece of a jigsaw puzzle with little fingers and strips going out this way and that, and
that's my Italian peninsula.
Coordinating services to this little island over here and this little strip over there can be very difficult. So the grid system is an example of where things have changed. Although I don't believe that, and I think, did you guys investigate this, that it has produced the type of savings that the mayor claims? Right. And there have been a little pockets of controversy along the way with that. But it does seem like, you know, Mayor Daley introduced this concept of trying to, you know, take away some of that aldermanic control over some of these services, but sort of backed away from it and just kind of, let's just do this 3-1 system. And I think they route a lot of 311 requests through the alderman so they can have a little piece of that action, so to speak, to be involved in that process. But this just is one of those things where it's time, we can do this more efficiently, we can save some money. Maybe it's time to move.
See, I never bought the switch to the grid system as a way of saving money. I mean, it might have saved a little bit here and there, and that's what it was touted as. But as with all things in the Emanuel administration, what's printed in the press release and what the reality is are often very, very different. And in this case, I think that's what it is. I think it's a matter of getting rid of ward soups. I mean, you know, really, like Chicago for decades has been really run by ward soups, and now the ward soup doesn't even get to pick what your garbage is collected anymore.
Right.
So,
but if you think about it, I mean, it can save money and save time ultimately, in maybe the number of crews you want. I mean, imagine that on one block or one side of a block, you could have garbage collection on Tuesday, and on the other side, because it's the next block over, because it's in a different ward, is on Thursday, and you've got different trucks coming to the same blocks or just a couple blocks away, and it's just not as efficient. So in a way, and a lot of the other requests, you know, taking a lot that control of an alderman to say, you know, that block didn't, I'm looking at the precinct there, that didn't really vote for me as strong as I wanted. Maybe they won't get new garbage carts.
You said you wanted tree trimming? Yeah. Well, let's see, I'll put you on the list.
Right, I've got a donor over here, though.
That's right.
And I mean, the ward boundaries, it's a nonsensical way of determining the way a number of things should happen. And we've heard certain communities, be it the Inglewood community, be it Chinatown, who've said, hey, look, you know, the way these ward boundaries are drawn just really limits the effectiveness that we can have as a constituency, but also in terms of what actually makes sense in serving this community. Where one community, we're not technically 4 different communities who, you know, you know, not to, you know, to advocate for a grid system, but doing things along those ward boundary lines, I think, is problematic in a whole host of reasons.
One interesting thing, if you ever want to have a historical discussion, it might be kind of fun to do it. Chicago was set up as a strong council, weak mayor sort of government.
Yes.
But it hasn't operated that way in, I don't know if ever, but at least since,
Since
was
probably the day
Bathhouse
they
John
signed that
in the-
legislation, yeah.
in the 1920s. I mean, it's never really operated that way.
Right,
Certainly not under Mayor Daley the first and Mayor Daley
Yeah,
the second.
yeah.
So
Yeah. So, Alden, you have a fascinating role now because you are a journalist. You've spent your life in and around journalism, and you went to work for the BGA, and the BGA has kind of set up its own in-house, I would say, journalism shop. It's not really; it's investigations. But you do investigations now, and I really love some of the work you've done. I think it's really interesting to see that level of commitment from an organization like BGA. It's a really cool thing. And you have done a couple of stories about the Larrys, about Larry Hoover and Larry Huggins, and also, of course, about Terry Peterson. Now, I want to have you kind of just bring us up to date on that as much as you can. Larry Huggins was in the news not too long ago because he was one of the Metro guys who was dismissed, let's say, from the Metro Board. He has ties to Larry Hoover, the notorious gang guy, and so does Terry Peterson.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, we really kind of stumbled across this. We were hunting Larry Huggins down for a story we'd done about him inviting a top Metro executive, one who had been considered a replacement for Alex Clifford, who kind of got this whole Metro mess started. Inviting him to a fundraiser, and in trying to get Mr. Huggins to kind of comment on that, we called his office a number of times, stopped by there, and we came across a woman by the name of Wendy Jenkins, and the name didn't initially ring a bell.
Working in his office.
Working in his office, but when we discovered who Miss Jenkins was, we had a whole set of another questions to ask Mr. Huggins, but Miss Jenkins is the common law wife of Larry Hoover. And as we learned in the federal case that sent Hoover from state prison to federal prison in the mid-90s, Ms. Jenkins was actually a very integral part of the Gangster Disciples operation. I'm not saying that she sold drugs or did anything illegal, but she was a conduit, as the feds uncovered, between Hoover in prison and many of his Gangster Disciple leaders on the outside, relaying messages, setting up meetings, so on and so forth. So, we wanted to talk with Ms. Jenkins about this, and she didn't really want to say much more than that. But we also wanted to ask Mr. Huggins, why he'd hired Ms. Jenkins, if he knew the elder Hoover. We also came to find out that he had helped Hoover's son, Larry Hoover Jr., get started in the construction trades business, and that he'd also done business with a couple of different companies of Ms. Jenkins. He'd rented space to one of the companies, and then he'd actually hired on a construction company that she'd started a few years later to do work with his construction firm. So, we just had a whole host of questions about what was the level of the relationship and why, and we're still digging. But as you can imagine, Mr. Huggins wasn't very interested in talking with us, and we haven't actually got him to speak to us directly. Peterson kind of came into that because as we were kind of researching Hoover, and we were looking into this mid-90s public relations essentially attempt to get him paroled, and Peterson's name was on a letter along with former Alderman Alan Streeter to parole Hoover, and kind of likened him to a potential community savior if he were paroled.
Something
so
he denies today.
He denied knowledge of the letter, or that he had signed the letter and that someone had signed for him, he said.
A great piece of investigative work that you can see at bettergov.org, and I really encourage everybody to do that. Some great investigative work being done by you guys.
Thanks
Congratulations
so much,
on that. David Schaper, NPR, thank you so much. We'll
Thank
see you
you for
again
having
sometime
me.
soon,
Yeah.
okay? All right, and Alden Loury from the BGA. Glad to have you both with us today. You have been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You know about that because you know that you can watch us right here anytime you want. You can see us on cable. You can see us right here on YouTube anytime you would like to do so, and we hope you will do so, and that you will come back again next week, because we'll be right back with another show a week from now. Thanks. I'm Ken Davis. See you next week.